Hi, this is Peter Friedrich, and today we're speaking with Dr. Ather Zia, author of Resisting Disappearance, about the issue in Kashmir. So, Dr. Zia, I want to welcome you and thank you for offering your time and being willing to
Thank you.
express your opinions about the Kashmir issue and what's on your heart and what's in your mind about what's happening there right now. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a political anthropologist. I'm a poet, and my area of research and my homeland is Kashmir, and that's something that is very dear to my heart. What's happening to the region right now, and what's always been happening to it in the last 77 years, which is probably what made me a researcher and a writer. And I also have founded Kashmir Lit. It's an online magazine which has the writings that come out of the region and also from the diaspora. It's mainly literature, but it's also opinion pieces, poetry, and all kinds of creative writing. Then I also have helped co-found Kashmir Critical Kashmir Studies Collective. And it's a group of academics, and it's a growing group of academics that are Kashmiris and that work on Kashmir region. And that's something that we've been hard at work on for the last 1 decade, because we felt that a lot of people are talking about Kashmir. It's not as if it's not written about. It's not as if it's not talked about, but it's not the Kashmiri voice that's getting heard. And it's not as if Kashmiris have not written. It's not as if Kashmiris have not spoken, but it is so limited to their own region, it doesn't come out. So you will see in the last 1 decade, if you kind of just take a stock of the Kashmir study, you'll see a lot of young Kashmiris in different universities studying Kashmir and trying to look at their history and trying to say what we want to say. So that's the motive behind the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective. So that's pretty much it. That sums it. And I also write poetry.
So then let me ask you, Dr. Zia, as you are talking about Kashmiri voices speaking about what's going on in Kashmir historically and in the present, as a Kashmiri, can you tell me and tell us what's happening in Kashmir right now and why is it so significant? And especially, why is it different compared to what's been happening in Kashmir for the past several decades?
What we see happening in Kashmir right now is a very intense siege. It's the 13th day of the siege since August 4th. And there's already 700,000 army in the region, Indian forces. And what's happening right now is that they have now there's a news trick that is some 50,000 phones have been released and people are trying to call back. So they're kind of trying to ease the restrictions. But when it started, there was a huge communication gap, communication blackout that happened, and people were not able to talk to family back home. And we also heard about the troops. And they Kashmiris on the ground, the natives, the locals, they already knew that something was up, because what India had done was there was a series of orders that were being issued from the government authorities. There were that the troops are being flown in, and then the pilgrims who come for the annual pilgrimage in the Himalaya, which is this natural ice formation that they think is the avatar of one of their gods. So they come for that pilgrimage, and they had come for that. And then they took those pilgrims out, they evacuated them. And then they also evacuated tourists. So that was August 4th. That was the run up to August 4th. And then Kashmiris were already, there was this ominous kind of a feeling, and I could sense that in my family that I was talking to back home. And people were stocking up because they knew something was up. And they also talked about how it was very different from what the previous curfews and crackdowns and sieges had been, because there was a lot more army and a lot more paramilitary on the ground. And there were all kinds of rumors floating around, but people knew it was about the special article. It was about autonomy, but no one was really sure what was happening. People thought it was war, and there were also aircrafts flying over. There are drones, so it's a very intense siege. And what's different right now is that no news is coming from Kashmir. What's happening, what used to happen in the past is that there would be a little bit of Wi-Fi left somewhere. Maybe the landlines would work if the cell phones were not working, if there were not other forms of communication. Even basic cable was shut down. And what they also did, the news that's coming out, and people have some contact on the ground. I haven't been able to talk to my parents so far. I haven't been able to talk to my extended family so far, because there have been like one or two messages from someone, but they haven't been followed up because they probably didn't get the connection again. What they've done to the city is that the journalists who have been able to write, journalists were completely cut down. The newspaper was 2 pages, the front page and the sports section, which is an irony. And then that was like for a couple of days, and then they ran out of newsprint, which comes from New Delhi. And then there were no newspapers. If you look at the online portals of these newspapers, you'll see that they have been updated August 4th and nothing after, because the journalists were not issued any curfew passes. They didn't get any special, privileges that journalists usually do to report news. So some people who have been able to write about it in the last few days, they have said that the city looks very strange, because the kind of siege that is on ground, the razor wire is changed twice or thrice a day, so that people are not able to move from one locality to another. And if they do, then when they come back, they don't know how to go through the maze because they've changed the wire. So those are the tactics that are used on ground, so people cannot move from locality to locality. So everything is localized. So Eid, one of the Muslim holidays, which is considered to be one of the big holidays, it was very recently, last week. There was, and people celebrate it in congregations. There's a big prayer meeting that happens, and people try to go to that because it's mandatory. That's one of their Muslim rituals. They were not able to do that, but people did try to do that in their localities, and they did go, but it was like very small, very concentrated. They couldn't move out. So they have been able to go to the very local mosque, the hyper local mosque, but not to the mosque that they would have preferred to go, because there was, right now there's an order against assemblies, that you cannot, more than 4 people cannot, and that's always been the law. It's always been prevailing. That's an unsaid law, that a congregation of or assembly of more than 4 people is considered to be a law and order situation in Kashmir. And there's also a curfew, but it's very arbitrary. Like there is a curfew and you need a curfew pass, but at the same time there might be a little movement, and then the government sells that as people are able to move, people are able to buy supplies, but no one knows for sure what's happening. They don't know whether they're being allowed to move or not. So, and there's like helicopters hovering about. There are drones, and of course there's lots of military. So there's a lot of fear in people. And when you lift territorial protections, and you also have a right-wing Hindu government which has a Hindu supremacist agenda, and this is very well known in Kashmir from 1947, we don't have to guess what people are thinking.
So as you've mentioned, Dr. Zia, these newspapers and these journalists in Kashmir have really been unable to report for these past 2 weeks. And the online portals of these newspapers have not been updated since the 4th or maybe the 5th. We also have seen that these mainstream Kashmiri politicians like Mehbooba Mufti and Omar Abdullah, that they've been under house arrest, and Mehbooba Mufti, who's quite active on Twitter, it's the similar situation with her own Twitter account, is that it's not been active since the 4th, I believe, maybe the 5th. So you recently wrote about this, and you described these politicians as India's own collaborators who have been arrested. Even though they're Kashmiri politicians, but this is the terminology that you used for them. So I want to ask you, as many other Kashmiris that I've spoken with have described these people as Delhi's representatives in Kashmir, and they were formerly in coalition government in Kashmir with the BJP. Why is it now that they're out of favor with the BJP, and why have they been arrested?
Well, I think India's policy in Kashmir has always been, it has not changed. They have always had very aggressive integrationist politics that they played inside Kashmir. To understand this, we have to kind of backpedal and go back to 1947. So why is it that these collaborators are right now in the jails, and they're not allowed to move about, they're not allowed to talk to people, and they're being given the same treatment as what the resistance and freedom movement, the people who are with freedom movement called the Hurriyat, they're pretty much given the same treatment right now. So I would like to see this as how BJP has stepped up the integrationist policy. What the previous governments would do was that they eviscerated the autonomy through quote unquote legal means. They would have a statute here, a presidential order here. So what they slowly did was they eroded Kashmir's autonomy, because since Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who actually was one of the architects of engineering this with a section of Kashmiri politicians and people, not the entire Kashmir, that we will have this Article 370 with India. What they thought would happen was that when this relationship was formed, what it would do is it would allow India to kind of like slowly come into Kashmir with its own laws and all kinds of policies and plans, and slowly integrate Kashmir. So that was their hope, that down the line, that Article 370, and they have said this in various places, many Indian politicians, including Jawaharlal Nehru, they have kind of predicted that it's going to remain a shell of its former self because the people will be integrated with India. But that hasn't happened. And now since 2014, you have BJP in power. And now they have majority in both houses. And they hold a considerable sway on the Indian masses who have been, pushed to who are being pushed and pushed and pushed. And I think now they're somewhere extreme right, most of the masses. They do have an anti-Muslim agenda. They have always hated. They have always talked about Article 370 and its abrogation. That has been and it was on their election manifesto as well. And it has been a demand, the party's demand, ever since it became the party it is. It has always been their manifesto that this is going to be removed. So in 2014, when they came in, what they did was initially there was this public interest litigation that was filed in the Supreme Court. So the conversation kind of started and it started building up. And Kashmiris knew that this was highly imminent because this is what the BJP had all along been talking about. And the bigger fear was that there are going to be people behind it because Indians also, most Indians, especially the liberal left, has also, it's almost like they will talk about human rights violations in Kashmir, but when it comes to integration, everyone is pretty much the same. Everyone pretty much thinks that they own Kashmir. So what's different with BJP and why they have imprisoned the collaborators is because they are not playing the, let's say the backstabbing. There's a beautiful analogy, although it's not beautiful in the face of tragedy that it's been said. But a Kashmiri quoted recently, he said that what the previous governments have done, they used to stab us in the back, and BJP has stabbed us from the front. So what BJP's policy is a spectacle. It's a spectacle for the rest of the country. It's a nationalistic might, imperialistic might that they're showing us, which the previous governments were kind of holding back, even though they were as proud as these people to do all of the things that they have done with Kashmir's autonomy. They eroded it, they eviscerated it, they took away most of the rights that Kashmiri government had, and they brought in the center list, quote unquote, the center list from Delhi, and that everything was brought under that. So that has happened in the past. BJP is just more militaristic. It's more, so it doesn't need those people. It doesn't need the fig leaf of these collaborators to have this facade of democracy, like right now, because that's what's been happening in Kashmir. It's a politics of democracy. It's a facade that they have propped up, that we're going to have a democracy. It's a puppet regime they have always had. It's a theater where they would have these people, they would hold elections, and they had their own little coteries, and then they would tell the rest of the world that this is Kashmiri people are already taking part in the elections, so this is a democracy and they're with us. But the truth is that most of these governments have been predetermined. And of course, there are people in Kashmir who want to accede to Pakistan. And a small group of people is there who are pro-India, like these collaborators. But then the majority of Kashmiris, they've always been fiercely nationalistic. They do not see themselves as any other people in India. So that's something that's undying. So right now, what we see is that BJP doesn't really care for for international opinion in that sense. It sits atop a huge market, and it's doing a lot of arms trade with various key players. So they pretty much know it's the moment of the big men. So that's what's happening in India right now. So, and they are also sending a message to other Muslims across India. Muslims, as you know, right now are under siege in India, Indian Muslims too, with the lynchings, and which are normalized in India now. So this was a Muslim majority state, so it's a no-brainer that the fear of demographic change in Kashmir is a palpable fear.
So, Dr. Zia, as you've just mentioned, that from your perspective, this wave of lynchings that we've seen in India against Muslims, against Dalits, that it's become normalized. Now, I want to ask you what normal is like in Kashmir, because the government's recent actions in Kashmir, those are one thing. But as you've alluded to, there has been this ongoing issue for 70 years, 80 years. And you've also edited this anthology, which is very, very evocatively titled "A Desolation Called Peace." Now, why is this title as it is? Why do you say that? And what is normal for Kashmiri?
Well, the title is borrowed from, and he has borrowed it from another philosopher. It's Agha Shahid Ali. He has used it in a poem, and he talks about that, it's the same, like right now you see these news articles coming from the Indian media, and they say things are normal, eat past normally, all of that. What's normalcy in Kashmir? That people are inside, they're under siege, and they're not able to go out. They are so controlled, they cannot talk to anyone. And in the evening, you have a news report, which comes from the state broadcasting company, and they say that nothing happened during the day, everything was normal, and people were inside. They don't have the right to move, they don't have right to assembly. So of course you will have, quote unquote, a cosmetic peace, which is absence of violence, but everything basically is desolate because people are withering away in their homes. People are imploding within. If you know Kashmir, you will see that Kashmiris are very, very political. They're very smart. They have been raised on a diet of politics, and they can gauge what's happening outside. I mean, they don't really need news to know what's happening around them, even though right now they have been kept away from each other. So what I see, what normalcy in Kashmir, there is no normal in Kashmir anymore, except that if you do not have a lot of deaths or killings, but you have pellet injuries, you have protests, the government thinks this is also normal. And for people, militarization has become very normal. Just think about this, that stocking up for this siege, again, it's part of the normal. Kashmiris keep a stock for because we are people from the mountains, so we have to keep stock. So we used to keeping stocks. That's our history, that's our legacy, but that's something environmental. But since the last 33 years, people have always stocked up because something might happen. So you have lots of lentils, you have lots of rice, you have lots of dried foods, you have lots of powdered milk, you have a supply of gas that you might need, you have all kinds of things that you need in case of survival for in a war. So Kashmiris do stock that up, and that's a normal, and people know this is going to happen. Things are kept for the time when something might happen. So that's how what's normal living under militarization. But at the same time, they have accepted that this is a reality around them. But at the same time, they have a lot of agency. So what's happening right now is that, in my opinion, the Indian government forces, they have been used to, they do use indiscriminate force on Kashmiris, which is why we have more than 70,000 killings, and we have more. My own work is on enforced disappearances, which is more than 10,000 disappearances, both of combatants and non-combatants. And a key in that is that most of the men were bearded. So, who had the stereotypical Muslim look. Which is also a shorthand for the Islamophobes, that this is someone who is an extremist of some sort. So that's the legacy of this invisible war that has been waged on Kashmiris, and that's not normal. But at the same time, there is a lot of resistance. It's not only armed, and very recently, till 2016. The armed movement had ebbed. It had ebbed in a way that it was still existing, but what also had happened was that people in the grassroots and intellectuals began kind of producing a resistance that many people liken to Intifada. And there is this idea of Kashmiri Intifada. There are books published where writers have used the word. I also use the word in my own work, because that's what we see, that everyone in Kashmir has an opinion. They might not say it because they know it can get killed. People are resisting. So under militarization, there's no normal. Everything is abnormal. But the government likes to liken any kind of desolation that they create. And that desolation is people are inside their homes and they're not able to go out. They're not able to speak. They're not able to tell the world that whatever was remaining of this autonomy was still important to them, because it meant territorial protection. Of course, the thing that they have enforced on people right now is a very oppressive. It's an oppression that's kind of like permeating since the last 33 years and even 72 years in different manners, but more direct militarily, it has been in effect since 33 years. So they have created a desolation right now, and they've always created a desolation, because if we look at what's happened to Kashmir since the last 72 years, it's been gradually militarized. And there's been a gradual militarization. The first lot flew in 1947. They were there before in the region. So October 27th is not the formal date of them coming into the region. They were there before that. So then gradually it increases. And since 1989, it's increased exponentially. So that's what they have created. It's a new normal that has been imposed on Kashmiris, that if you don't have many pellet gun injuries, if you do not have many killings, oh, the day passed okay. But that's not normal by any standards.
So I would like to ask you, as you said, much of your work has been on this issue of enforced disappearances. And you mentioned that something like 10,000 people since 1989, I believe, have been disappeared.
8,000 plus, 8,000 to 10,000.
I recently spoke with Professor Junaid from Massachusetts, and he told me that the official Indian government figures of deaths since 1989 are about 60,000, but that he would speculate that about 80,000 have died, and that the vast majority of those are innocent civilians, not combatants and not militants. So I would like to get your perspective on this issue of disappearances. Who are these disappeared people? Why were they disappeared? What happened to them? And also, if you are able to, can you briefly touch on this issue of this gentleman, Jalil Andrabi, and who he was and what happened to him?
Well, Jalil Andrabi, so that's something that we, when we study human rights and when we look at Kashmir and we look at legal mechanisms, we kind of see how we struggle against like so many layers of invisibility. So Jalil Andrabi was a lawyer. He was also an opinion leader. And he was also operating within a time when the military regime had cracked down brutally on Kashmir. So that was the time, I think it was 1994 or 1996, I forget the exact date, or maybe earlier, when he was a human rights lawyer and he wanted to internationalize the issue. He was traveling for that, and he was open. If he was allowed to live, he would have taken the matter to various places because he was connected, he was articulate, he was smart, and he was also wedded to the idea of that self-determination and independence. So that's who he was. I think he was a pioneer of what a lot of us are doing right now. And being one of the early pioneers, he was also very disadvantaged because he was inside Kashmir. And that's the problem. When you're inside the Kashmir, things become dangerous, manifold. And he was also he was detained first, like detained. His wife knew, and then they kind of like tried to find him. And then you had this Major Avtar Singh, who actually was in California, in Torrance. Finally, he had a trucking company there after he left the army, and how all of that was engineered because that guy was a very well-known. You could say he was a mass torturer. He was a mass murderer in that sense, because he was in the army. He was this brutal figure for Kashmiris, and his name was connected to a lot of killings and a lot of encounters, and there's a lot written about him. So he's the one who picked up Jalil Andrabi, and then he's the one who there was a case against him, and Jalil Andrabi was quote unquote disappeared, and then his corpse, it kind of like was in a bag that was found in the Jhelum, dismembered. And so that's what was done to him, because he was speaking for human rights violations in the early 90s. And it's been well documented by various human rights organizations of what happened to him. So regarding my expertise, like talking about enforced disappearances, this is of course competence and non-competence. So my work actually, I forget what the focus of your question was, but enforced disappearances has been one of the technologies of punishment that has been meted out on Kashmiris. So it was very, very prevalent in the 90s, and incommunicado detentions were not unheard of. And sometimes so you would have a person who would be taken, and he would be arrested and detained, and then they would be somewhere, and your family would go and they would want to look for you and find you. And it became sort of a ritual for many families when people were arrested and picked up. Sometimes you knew that the person was picked up, someone was a witness, but most of the time someone just left in the morning, never returned. And then, so that's how majority of these disappearances.
Let me ask you, I've spoken with several young Kashmiris who have given me accounts of growing up in Kashmir, and how as they would leave for school in the morning, that their mothers would look at them and kind of say goodbye to them in a sense, because their mothers had this feeling, this sense that, well, my son may never actually come home at the end of the day. And of course, everyone that I've spoken with, that didn't happen to them. They did come home, but that was the feeling that they got from their parents, from their mothers growing up in Kashmir, was this sense of danger and menace and this constant threat that, well, if my son leaves and goes to school this morning, he might not come home tonight. Is that What do you have to say about that?
Well, I was also, I mean, I grew up during that time as well. When I started, when I was in school, this all started. And that has been my life as well. We all have lived through that, those kind of moments and those kind of feelings and that kind of post-trauma. We are all in that kind of trauma. I think we still live, there's no post to the trauma. So the fear, the fear of someone disappearing, it was also normalized because that was what was happening all around us. And it wasn't as if you had to be an armed combatant to be picked up and detained and arrested. It could be anyone because it was just a mechanism of terror. My work, my work is on, my book is called Resisting Disappearance. And I talk about it's women's activism and military occupation in Kashmir. So basically, we have this group of women who are mothers. There is a pioneer co-founder to that movement. Her name is Parveena Ahangar. She was recently, in 2017, she was given the RAFTO Prize for Human Rights. She co-shared it with her co-founder of the movement. And the movement that they founded is Association for Parents of Disappeared Persons. So that was founded in 1994. So every month you had these mothers meeting in a park, trying to, protest for their missing, for their disappeared children. And these are mostly men. There are not many known cases of women's disappearance, so to speak. There are rapes, of course, which kind of is a different trauma and technology of terror and punishment altogether. But most of the disappeared are men. So yes, there's always been a fear. In the 90s, people lived under that fear. And when that was happening, you also had, it's a very, I talk about this in my book, like what happened to the society. So you had women, you had mothers, and you had sisters who would always, like if you had a errand to run and there would be a male family member who had to go out to buy some medicine in the evening, or they had to leave early in the morning, the mother, the wife, or the sister, they would say, no, we have to come with you. We want to come with you, because it was kind of like seen as, if he leaves alone, the army might stop him, the paramilitary might stop him, and then they might do something. And it was kind of like a shorthand. If a woman was moving with this person, they probably are a family, so that somehow made them less of combatants. But at the same time, it was not a guarantee that this man would be safe or this woman would be safe. And many people have been killed during those hours and times, just walking, getting medicine, even during curfews. So women would shape their own men because there was always a fear, because there was the security discrimination, especially against men more than women. But it was not as if women were protected. It was not as if there was a guarantee that women always, even now, they've always been physically vulnerable. There have been cases of rapes and mass rapes. And it's even Human Rights Watch did a report where it was seen that rape has been used as a weapon of war, and there are documented cases. So it's a different kinds of vulnerabilities that the occupation has picked up on. And so in that sense, that's been pretty much the life of most Kashmiris. One, I think two, that's the Medicine Sans Frontiers. According to one of their surveys, 2 in every Kashmiris have either been tortured or witnessed torture. So, it's kind of like, that's the statistic. I think it might be more now. That's the statistic I have. It's probably dated, and we don't have a new one, but I'm sure it's more now, because now you have the pellet gun, which a lot of people kind of connect to beasts and think about hunting when they think about this, but it's proven to be very fatal. And now we have mass blindings happening. So it's almost like in every decade, there has been a new technology of torture and punishment that's been used. So 90s was the time of disappearances. 90s was the time of extreme killings. And not that killings have stopped. Our disappearances have kind of ebbed, and I think the last one was 3 years ago. But it's not like there's not mass disappearances like kids disappearing from left, right, and center as it was in the 90s. enforced disappearances. And then there are government narratives where they first don't, so different governments that came, they gave the different spin to the enforced disappearances. Many of them used to say that these are people who have passed on through the LOC and they have gone to Azad Kashmir for training, and then they probably have died or have been killed, and that's why they are not disappeared but missing. And some, they would say that they've just fled across LOC because they were doing all kinds of things here and they didn't want to be here. So again, they're missing. And the number has varied ridiculously from 60 to 3,000. And then sometimes it kind of goes back to 1,000. And APDP kind of documents those fluctuations, and I've done that in my book as well. So it's almost like an affront. It's an outrage for people. And then they also cast aspersions on these organizations. There are two APDPs currently working, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. Both of them have documented cases, but both of them are under duress because being a human rights organization in Kashmir, it's not easy to work. So they can't go to every home and document cases, but they have a big documentation, they have data. And then aspersions are cast on the data that they have, that, oh, they don't have enough, they're just amplifying these numbers, they're not this big number, it's not 8,000, it's not 10,000. But people know, and people have had that kind of experience on ground. And these are organizations that have been working for the last 33 years on this. And they know their stuff. They know who has been disappeared. They have connections, and they have been ongoing. And now today, when you think about human rights movement in Kashmir, APDP is kind of the face of that movement. The women, the mothers, they are the face of that movement. And I think the world also recognized that after the APDP co-founders got the RAFTO Human Rights Prize. So yeah, that's the saga of disappearances.
So, Dr. Zia, as we start to move towards a conclusion in our conversation, and as this curfew and this blackout of communications in Kashmir is ongoing, although there is some talk of it being lifted in part or in whole in the coming days, I want to ask you a couple of questions. One is, how has this personally impacted you? And then the other is, what do you think will happen? What are the potential consequences of the government's actions, which we may see manifest once the curfew and the communications blackout is lifted?
So how it personally has impacted me, I think, Kashmir to me is my homeland. Of course, the family aspect of it, the intimate aspect of it, that I haven't been able to get in touch with my family, that is something that bothers me. I don't know what's happening around them. I'm sure they have enough stock because that's what Kashmiris do. I don't fear for their, I'm not fearing starvation, but of course, they are under huge trauma, they're under huge stress, and that goes for all Kashmiris right now. They don't know what's happening outside, they don't have news, and then electricity is not known to be steady in Kashmir. So are they getting some basic cable? But BBC has increased its shortwave transmissions to the region because they have recognized that there is no news going in. So maybe they're listening to the radio. So you can kind of see how much duress these people are living in, especially in 2019 when we are so used to be connected. So that's one part of how it's impacted me. And the second part is, as a Kashmiri, I'm really shocked. I'm not surprised, but I am shocked terribly by the siege and the way it's been intense and the way it's been brutal. At the same time, losing territorial sovereignty for the region. I had no personal loyalty to Article 370. I have no personal loyalty or political loyalty to accession to India, whatever that is, the very, very contested accession to India, by a section of politicians lording over a section of people who mostly, because this is not really focused on, but Kashmir was getting out of near slavery when the accession and when that political machinations were happening. These were very poor people. these people had lived under a very different tyrannical rules for almost 500 years, and they'd lost most of they were indentured slaves. They were living in near slavery, and they were living under heavy taxation. So yeah, at that time, a section of people following a leader who was kind of like, who considered himself to be the savior of Kashmiri people. So I kind of like have contest the accession. I contest, and I have no personal loyalties to 370. But what was important and what we consider to be a sort of a legal protection was the 35A, the territorial protection, the territorial sovereignty of Kashmir, which meant that only Kashmiris had right to franchise, only Kashmiris could buy land. But that did not mean that India was not coming into Kashmir and doing its business. It was doing its business through leases, like lease for 99 years for a very minuscule amount of that they would give. The other part of it that India also leveled against the 370 was gender discrimination. It said that if women were marrying non-Kashmiris, they lost their domicile and they lost their citizenship. But I think that is just a red herring. That is just an argument that is meant to throw people away and use the buzzwords that are going to appeal to global community, because gender discrimination sounds so, just reforming the discrimination sounds so nice, So that wasn't the case. That was actually something, there have been different cases that women have fought, and they have fought through it. They were able to get a ruling from the High Court that women cannot lose citizenship after they marry non-Kashmiris, and they were not. They would get their property. But what was contentious was what happens to their children. Do they receive the mother's property? Now that also depended on like where did they live and what. So the different governments, they had set up committees to look into it. And what was being done was that these cases were being dealt on case-by-case basis. So if you had a child after you married a non-Kashmiri, you would kind of like, just work with the revenue officers to kind of like draw a will and see what happens to your estate. So it wasn't as if women were losing everything, which the government of India played up, saying that, if you marry non-Kashmiri, Kashmiri women are disenfranchised and they lose everything. That was not really the case on the same level. I'm not saying that there were not issues and it wasn't great, but I'm not saying that it was the way it was portrayed by government of India. So I think 35 territories for Kashmiris was very, very important. And that is going to be, that it's with the revocation, that's going to be taken away. And what that brings in is something that we have to watch out for a couple of things. When the siege lifts, how are people going to express their opinion? Because they do have an opinion. And not everyone is an old Kashmiri who probably has a lot of sage wisdom. These are young people. Most of the Kashmiris, I don't have the complete statistics, but they're young. And they know their history. They know their history like anything. They're more well-versed in history, and they are very canny, and they're not going to take it lying down. So that's one of the biggest fears. And then what's going to happen to Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which is, army is the de facto ruler. It's a martial law.
Which is this act which basically grants impunity to the army, the security forces operating within that territory, isn't it?
Yeah. So what's going to happen? And now you have New Delhi directly ruling Kashmir, and of course they will have their smokescreen elections. They will have people who they will prop up. I'm sure they have already groomed a couple of people for taking the helm of the affairs. And at the same time, with the bifurcation that they have done, they just haven't revoked the autonomy. They have bifurcated the region, and then they are also doing the delimitation thing. They're kind of like reorganizing the constituencies. So all of the things, the politics inside Kashmir, it's kind of like what they're trying to do is to dilute the Muslim majorityness, if for the lack of a better word. And that will be something that's in the offing. But what does it bring Kashmiris? What does immediately? For Kashmiris, I think immediate is what kind of protests will they be doing? And this will not be done as form of loyalty to India, that they want to be with India, but they do fear demographic terrorism. There are articles written on it. There are books written on it. Kashmiri human rights lawyers and writers, they have written about this very situation, and there's no hidden agenda. Basically, of course, there's a hidden agenda when because BJP doesn't tell the world, or Indian government doesn't tell the world that they're doing this for this. They're saying it's development, it's progress. So there is but Kashmiris kind of know what's the apparent agenda of what's been done. And they know that India has this fascination for Kashmir being the place from where everything has, being the original Hindu. So all of that mythological connections that they're drawing. So there is that element there as well. So there is a lot of fear.
So as you've mentioned, the BBC is increasing their frequency, they're increasing the power on their transmissions in order to try and get them into Kashmir. And you also mentioned that this Major Avtar Singh, who was responsible for the killing of this human rights activist, Jalil Andrabi, he ended up settling in California, where he died several years ago. He committed suicide after he killed his whole family.
Yeah.
As I recall. So certainly we see that this international media is taking a role in what's happening in Kashmir and trying to assist. And we've seen reports from the BBC and from Al Jazeera, which are some of the few to emerge from Kashmir. We've also seen, of course, with Major Avtar Singh, that these issues of human rights violations actually do impact the United States on the other side of the world. And as these people enter into the diaspora, this politics can even impact the local communities in the West. So I want to ask you, what do you think that the international community should be doing? What role does it have to play, if any? What can it do?
I think international community, I'm not talking about just the global powers. I'm talking about communities. They can do a lot, because I feel the world is, even though we see so many wars and we see so much destruction and we see so much bloodshed every day across the world, and it's kind of in our households now, because we see all of it, and we see it on the TV screens, we see it on our phone screens. So I feel if we have that aspect of the world, but the other aspect of the world is that there are lots of good people who want to do good. So if India and Pakistan, so there's another part is India is very belligerent. It doesn't really care about world opinion, because it knows that with the market power and all kinds of grand illusions of grandeur in South Asia, that it probably has the powers that it needs to hegemonize the entire region. So what we actually see is that they had a deterrence. There was a deterrence policy that they would not be the first user of the nuclear weapon, but they are taking it away. They're doing away with it. So that's the talk right now. I don't know if the bill becomes a law or something. So what's happening to that? But we do see that this is a nuclear flashpoint. If there is any sort of accident here, if these two nations come to the brink of nuclear war and then it happens, there's not going to be any winners in the situation. And it's not only going to affect South Asia. We are a world community. This is just one planet. So there are going to be repercussions. I think rather than just thinking about this small anecdotal or maybe, just one-time individual things like Major Avtar coming into wherever he was, I forget the name of the place where he was.
Fresno, California.
Yeah, Fresno. Yeah. And then, being in the community and, having someone like that in your community. I think more than that, we have to think on a larger scale. We have to think about ecological crisis right now as well, because when India is opening up Kashmir like this, it's not just nationalism. It's not only diluting the Muslim majority and bringing in a Hindu influx. It's not only that, it's also a neoliberal agenda which wants to take indigenous rights of people and take over their resources. It's also about that. It's already an ecological disaster the way they have been going on with the different developmental projects that they have done. We need to take that into cognizance. But if there's a war, it's also going to be a nuclear disaster. Is the world community ready for that? Are these nations, I mean, the stereotype of India was this nation that does yoga and that is full of ahimsa, which is nonviolence. And those are good things that we have seen in the last 70 years. And that's what the world knows. When you say India, you hear Mahatma Gandhi, you hear nonviolence, you hear yoga. But looking at what they have done in Kashmir, what they do in the northeastern states, northeastern states, you see a nation that's aflame, and that's been imperialistic from the get-go. And now you see that come to fruition because you have these people who are very brazen in what they want. They are not diplomats like the previous governments, where they're not too big on diplomacy. They're big men, and they have a brazen agenda, and they say that with pride. It's a Hindu supremacist pride. That's what they have. So what you see in that part of the region right now, I think it should be a worry for every global solidarity movement. That once something happens there, it's not going to stay in South Asia. And so that's something we have to look at. What's India now and where it has come from? And of course, look at Pakistan as well. But in this equation, as we right now see, Pakistan is very small, and Pakistan has a lot of challenges. India is the one who is currently very, very belligerent. And they have an agenda to move on. It's almost like you only have to see. I've written this paper on viral videos, and one of the videos it's very important for all of us who want to kind of see the nature of Indian Army. It's an Indian officer reading a poem. Now, when we say a poem, it seems something very flowery, something very poetic, but he's actually singing a martial poem. It's also called Veer-Ras. So these martial poems are to invoke patriotism and invoke, but the martial poem that he's speaking is about war, and it's about killing Kashmiris. And then also talking about how they have this idea of conquest up to Lahore. If I remember correctly, the poem, if it mentions that, it's kind of like the British India that they're talking about, the one that British put together. So it's a very it's the illusion of grandeur and imperialism and hegemony over different cultures and people is what is happening right now. It's kind of that plan put into motion, and Kashmir is one part of that big puzzle. That's how I see it. And what's going to happen, we don't really know. How these laws will. So October 31st is when the revocation is going to come into effect. We haven't seen any news of what's going to happen till then, but the valley is under siege. They are trying to release local phones, landlines, not the cell phones, and so we right now are in this mode of firefighting, like how to get connected to people and how do they connect to each other. So it's almost like we are in this struggle for survival rather than thinking of a larger policy. There's a vacuum in Kashmir. They have ran out of prison space. Now they're turning private establishments into prisons. So that's happening in Kashmir right now. So how people are going to respond, that's a major issue. That's a major worry for all of us. And then how the government, the occupying government, is going to respond is a bigger worry.
So my final question for you then, Dr. Zia, is, as you've written, and let me quote what you've written, "The region of Kashmir is a festering wound since the partition of India by the British in 1947. Now, from your perspective, how can this festering wound be healed? and what is necessary in order to bring about stability and prosperity and peace in Kashmir?
I think in Kashmir, we do not have to reinvent any wheels. There's already a plan in place. The region has to be demilitarized, it has to be decolonized, and then the UN mandated self-determination has to be put into motion, and with the option of independence. And I know a lot of people think that it's a grandeur, illusions of grandeur for the region, but I don't think it's a tall order. I think the people of the region really, really deserve rest. They deserve healing, and the healing can come from international communities. Right now, in 2019, we have seen the failures of democracy. We've seen failures of big nations, and we've seen failures of these neo-colonial nations and post-colonial nations. And I think it's high time that we set an example in Kashmir, create the conditions at the global level for decolonizing, for demilitarization, and for giving people what has been promised to them in 1947, which they are clamoring for, which they have been asking for the last 77 years, 72 years. But I say 77 because I kind of formally take the Kashmiri movement back to 1931, before India and Pakistan were two nations. So, because their struggle is as old as any other struggle. So it didn't start with 1947. And that's another thing that the global community needs to know, because it helps them understand that Kashmir is not about terrorism. It's an indigenous struggle for people's rights, for their rights on their resources, for their rights on their territory. It's not a discrimination. It's not a discrimination to say that foreigners can't come in, and if they want to come in, there have to be processes in place. So if we don't kind of like go too far, we just think about a small agenda. I know it's just 3 words, and it's like a big process. Demilitarization and self-determination with the option of independence is the way to go. That's the only way that this can be solved for once and all.
Dr. Ather Zia, I want to thank you so much for your time and for being willing to offer and express what's on your heart and what's in your mind. And I stand with you in wishing for peace for Kashmir.
Just peace, I would say. Not a desolation.
A just peace.
A just peace. Thank you, Peter.